I'm a professor here at the Faculty of Law at McGill University, and we have the pleasure to host this meeting on the crime of human trafficking. Um, I will introduce the speakers. I was asked to say a few words about trafficking in terms of an introduction, and I have just one main message to bring, which is that trafficking is a complex phenomenon. It's a complex phenomenon because in the public discourse, um, most often it's misrepresented by politicians, by the media. They often don't know really what they're talking about, and they make they confuse trafficking with other activities. For example, um, trafficking intersects with many other concepts: forced marriage, forced labor, modern slavery, organ trade, trafficking in children, sexual exploitation, and the whole prostitution industry. So trafficking may be part of all, maybe one part of all this, but all these concepts need to be distinguished. Second, if we talk about, for example, modern slavery, it implies a trade. Contrary to, modern slavery, trafficking implies a trade, a movement inside a country, a movement across international borders. And it's an important industry. It's an industry. I think it's the third criminal industry in the world in terms of income revenues. Third, trafficking in human beings is often associated with smuggling of migrants when they are two very, very different operations, different types of operations. A priori, contrary to trafficking, migrant smuggling does not involve exploitation. Migrants pay for a service that states do not offer. Yes, it's underground. Yes, it's contrary to the law. But a priori, there's no exploitation. Now, being underground, it may be. You may start in a smuggling operation and end up in a trafficking operation. You may be in a smuggling operation and suddenly face theft, rape, murder, and many other crimes because it is underground. But these are two different things, and yet politicians often say smuggling and trafficking in the same sentence, as if it was one big concept. And fourth, these issues have been dealt with by states and by the UN mostly as a criminal activity without thinking about the social conditions, without much addressing the social conditions that make that activity possible. And that's unfortunate because we need to see why people fall for trafficking or people pay for smugglers or people do that. And so I want to highlight this complexity before we start. And we have, in order to help us see more clearly what trafficking is, we have excellent people on this panel. We will hear first Dr. Olivia Smith, who is an O'Brien Fellow in Residence at our Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. She is the Executive Director for the Caribbean Anti-Human Trafficking Foundation, and she has worked for many organizations that have contributed to the fight against trafficking. The American Bar Association, the British Institute for International and Comparative Law, the British Institute for International and Comparative Law, CARICOM, the U.S. Embassy in Barbados, the European Union delegation to Barbados, etc. And she brings to the conversation a wealth of experience and expertise. Maître Milton James Fernandes has been a sessional lecturer at McGill Faculty of Law. He has also been a professor paid by USAID at the National University of Rwanda, and he has worked at CIDU, which is the legal clinic at UQAM that works on international humanitarian issues. He has also had a number of test cases that are important at the Human Rights Committee at the UN and at the Supreme Court of Canada. Evelyn Calugay is a founding member of PNAI, the Filipino Women's Organization in Quebec, which has done so much to protect Filipino women in the case of trafficking, but more generally, very often the rights of women migrants generally, and particularly in the domestic services industry. Samuel Helgaro is a third-year law student here at McGill, and he volunteers for PNAI. And Taryn Wilkie is also a third-year law student here at McGill, working with the International Refugee Assistance Project and also volunteering with Solidarity Across Borders and PNAI. So I will now give the floor to Olivia Smith for 15 minutes. You have the floor, Olivia.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say it's my distinct pleasure to be here and thank you for taking time from your very busy schedules to be here. Today, we are going to look at human trafficking under the theme, Nobody's Property. We are looking at it against the international legal framework. The instruments of the international legal framework provides that solid legal support for the nation state, and it sometimes fills the gaps for the nation states in terms of their national legislation against trafficking. The presentation will look at the who, the why, and the where of trafficking. We will define it, look at the difference between smuggling and trafficking, the different types of exploitation that do occur, and how do we treat to it. I want to say from the outset, because of the limited time we do have to present, I do have a PowerPoint presentation that's very detailed, but for the purpose of the presentation, I will just speak to some important points, and we will have, at your request, a copy of the presentation available. So what is human trafficking? It is a crime, and it is a human rights violation that includes and involves the recruitment, movement, and exploitation of persons. The initial consent of a person is irrelevant if it is obtained through fraud, deception, or coercion. A child simply cannot consent to being trafficked. Trafficking is a process rather than a single offense, and it can occur cross-border and within the country. And we see a lot of this happening in Canada, where people, especially the indigenous persons, are moved or trafficked across the provinces. Why talk about human trafficking today? As François said earlier, it is one of the largest crimes, and it is a highly profitable crime that has certainly, from what we are assessing, grown significantly since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, under Article 4 specifically states, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Canada is party to this declaration. In 2000, November 2000, the United Nations adopted the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And one of the instruments was the Palermo Protocol, which seeks to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking of persons, especially women and children. They defined it as involving act, means, and purpose. It can be, for example, the act of recruiting a person through the means of violence or coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation, organ removal, or any of the other purposes. There are a number of other international conventions to which Canada is party, which supports the national legislation. And this is important because, as Professor Crépeau said just now, it is a complex crime. And sometimes the national legislation that speaks to trafficking does not go sufficient in trying to capture the perpetrators and getting them to a stage of prosecution. So therefore, we have to rely on the international instruments outside of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. There are also a number of special procedures in place at the UN level. And we have a special rapporteur for trafficking in persons and other procedures to assist us. It was felt by a number of countries after assessing the impact of the UN protocols and the conventions that they did not have sufficient teeth for implementation. And the United States stepped forward with the implementation with a Trafficking in Persons international report, which has a tier system where tier 1 says that governments fully comply, such as Canada, and tier 3, where there are some countries that do not fully comply, nor are they making sufficient efforts. Now, this big stick has proved to be somewhat very effective in that many countries think highly of their international standing, and they're very afraid of the financial sanctions that may accompany their non-compliance. But at the end, it must be the national legislation and the national support systems that make combating trafficking effective. International law obliges Canada and all other nations, therefore, to ensure that prosecution takes place. So there's a criminalization of the various forms of human trafficking, whether they're committed by the natural person or the legal person, which is in this sense a company. It also obliges states to raise awareness and train and collaborate. And Canada has been doing a goal that there's always more to be done. Protection. International law also obliges Canada and every other state to be able to correctly identify your victims, provide them with the necessary medical and other assistance, and to grant temporary residence and work permits to victims of trafficking. Canada is seen as a source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. And Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia have been identified as being principal human trafficking areas. Exemption of victims from prosecution. International standards recognize that trafficked persons should not be prosecuted for any offense connected to the condition of being a victim. For example, if a person steals or commits any other crime while being a victim, international standards hold that they should not be prosecuted. It also allows for the possibility of granted immunity to victims of trafficking under certain circumstances. Now, this is very interesting because we have a lot of states who tie the victim's cooperation with law enforcement with granting of stay. But we have under the Geneva Refugee Convention, Article 33, the which says a refugee in any manner whatsoever whose life or freedom has been threatened should be protected. And in the cases where victims don't cooperate with authorities, the principle of non-refoulement can also provide for a resident permit if that is not covered sufficiently in the national legislation. So Canada does have...
Olivia, could you kindly tell me what slide we're on, please?
Okay, we're on domestic legislation, Canada. So sorry, I had to run ahead of you because I'm mindful of the time. Here we are. In accordance with its ratification of the UN Palermo Protocol, Canada did introduce several changes to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and its criminal code. And so we have protocols that are limited to the transnational cases. But as we go on to the next slide, we will see that the Criminal Code of Canada also seeks to cover tools that hold traffickers accountable, and many other criminal code offenses are captured, which includes kidnapping, sexual assault, and other offenses. Now, this is important And I'm hoping that other countries can adopt this approach, because as we've seen, because of the complexity of the crime, sometimes it is necessary to use other pieces of legislation to try to still bring people before the courts. So I'll go on to the next slide now. And we often wonder, how do people end up being trafficked? There are so many reasons why people end up being trafficked. It could be the poor economies from which the victims come, but we know internally a lot of times it is because we have people who are simply vulnerable emotionally, vulnerable economically. There are so many reasons an individual can find themselves in such a situation. Poor law enforcement and corruption, infiltration of criminal organizations. We see a lot of that happening in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and creeping into the Caribbean states. That we have all of these as causes for the source countries having trafficking happening. Destination. This is a situation of supply and demand. Rampant demand for the sex from the sex industries make sure that there's always an environment for trafficking, and this is helped a lot by the corruption that's involved. I'll go on to the next slide. We cannot talk about trafficking today in 2022 without looking at the impact of trafficking, the impact of COVID-19 on trafficking. The closed borders, social distances, and the time spent online has really been a breeding environment for increased trafficking and for the traffickers engaging in more sophisticated methods, especially the use of technology. So the types of trafficking would be forced labor, trafficking of children, sexual exploitation for organs. There are so many reasons why people are trafficked, but these are some of the main ones. I'll go on to the next slide. Where does it take place? All around us. We know the obvious places of brothels and prostitution services. We know that it happens on agriculture and ranch work, factories, sweatshops. On the street, you might see begging and door-to-door sales, and in the home very often. And I'm sure that Milton and Evelyn can speak more to the issue of this happening with respect to domestic servitude. We go on to the next slide now that looks at trafficking versus smuggling. François did a very, very good job earlier of speaking to the issue of how states conflict the issue of trafficking and smuggling. We can even probably argue that some of them have their reasons for doing that. But human trafficking is a crime against the person, while trafficking by smuggling is a crime against a country. Victims either do not consent to their situation, or if they initially consent, that is rendered meaningless by what the traffickers do after, moving people across borders. However, with smuggling, the transaction is usually mutual, and smuggling is always transnational. The problem comes, and the International Organization speaks to this, of migration speaks to this a lot, where a person who is first engage in a smuggling transaction on arrival to their destination end up finding themselves in trafficking situations. And this is where the law has problems, because first we looked at you in the context of being breaking the law, and now you become a victim, and it's very hard for law enforcement agencies to wrap their heads around that sometimes. We're going to the next slide that speaks to who's involved in trafficking. There are many people involved. We can have large corporations running these businesses. We have trafficking networks, and then we have the individual traffickers. So there are a number of people who invest, recruit, transport, and of course, they're all facilitated by the public officers. I'll go on to the next one. We'll skip this one rather and look at how the traffickers control their victims, because we've spoken to that before. They can deprive the victims of their freedom, mobility, communication, deprive them of drugs if they're on drugs, or provide them with drugs to keep them drugged up. And often we see that there are lots of imaginary debts, paying for housing, food, and things that they never pay off for. And in some countries, they use hoodoo, voodoo, juju, because of the cultural nuances to get people under control. Because I say to you, I'll use voodoo and I'll kill you and your whole family, and immediately that person will comply, having believed that this is so. So I'll go on to
Conclusion, please,
the,
so that we can,
yes,
Olivia, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if we want to make sure that everyone has a turn,
yes.
conclusion, please.
So I'll conclude that the use of technology has increased. We can see of the case where the Justice Department in 2018 seized the back page. And one of the things we need to look at is the indicators of the crime of people around us. Are there new relationships, and are there relationships where gifts are given, manipulation and control happening? How do we treat to engage in them? We talk to them on their language and understand and accept them and their decisions, keep ourselves informed, and continue to share information. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to share with you.
You're most welcome. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. Milton James will now have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you. The virtual floor. I wonder if Evelyn might just open her microphone, because she might be able to pipe in on some of the things that I'm in a position to outline, but really comes from the wealth of experience that she's gained the hard way with her organization at Pinay over the last 25 years. If I were to add some context, what Dr. Smith talked to it is the structure around people coming to other places, the province of Quebec, and how circumstances contributing to vulnerability can create situations where trafficking occurs and other related wrongs, whether they be criminal nature, can be found. Now, I would look at this from the perspective of a supervisor of a legal clinic, right, in the province of Quebec. In the province of Quebec, we have restrictions around the practice of law and what students can do, right, in terms of assisting people who'd be seeking legal information. There's a very strict regime in place, unlike the province of Ontario, where students would have to work under supervisors like myself, attorneys in the province, to be able to contribute to legal proceedings or to draft anything to help any would-be victims. So this recipe of not having a sort of publicly funded legal aid system that would be able to address the concerns of, in this case, live-in caregivers, brings us right into context about McGill's, the legal clinic's partnership with Pinay, and how they've gotten to a position to discover and in certain cases try to address vulnerabilities that occur in this province. If I might just step back in time, I first met Evelyn, I guess, in relation to a case. Someone had come to the province of Quebec under a live-in caregiver program, the Programme d'Aide Familiale. And that's a system by which we fill needs in our labor market to help people take care of the young, the elderly, and people with disabilities. We have a special labor pool that we draw on people from beyond our borders, the Philippines, India, Latin America, to come and assist with those particular tasks. One of the understandings about this program is that people can come to Quebec, come to Canada, and contribute in that way, and they can apply for permanent residency for themselves, and then eventually come into a situation where they can bring their families here. So this is, so to speak, the deal. What happens for these women who are largely women, I guess, living in homes, and how do the vulnerabilities occur when you're living in someone's home? Essentially, they're the ones who are taking care of you, and you have problems that are beyond your employers to be able to assist you to deal with. Well, that's where Evelyn and Pinay come in. So in, I guess it was 2002, another McGill grad by the name of Mei Chu showed up in my office with a living caregiver who, she had a Canadian-born son, and she had unfortunately gotten sick. She had gotten cancer diagnosis at the time, and she wasn't able to fulfill the circumstances of her work visa. At the time, she had to do 24 months of work as a living caregiver within a 36-month period in order to qualify to apply for permanent residency. And she wasn't able to do that. And the cascading effect of that enlightened me as to how vulnerable and precarious a situation can become very quick. So the woman who's since passed away, she came in and said, my son has lost his Medicare card. This is the medical insurance. And I didn't understand. The son had been born here in the province of Quebec. How could he lose his Medicare card? Did you lose it? You can get another one. I obviously didn't understand. What had happened is he had become ineligible for it. Because in a story going back at least to 1994, we identified a provision of the Civil Code of Quebec, which excluded children born in Quebec from access to Medicare unless their parents had status. So if a parent loses status, the child loses the Medicare card. If I may, insane, right? As we started digging into this, we found that that was a vulnerability that came out of those circumstances of losing status, but being legally present in Canada along with a son. So if I were to move that story ahead, if anything has come out of this pandemic, it's the lucky situation where the current government, after several people have brought test cases, which have failed or been settled, has come around to the logic that the article of the Civil Code that defines domicile should not apply to children born in Quebec, and we should give them all Medicare cards, just like the same kids sitting in the classroom beside them. Never thought it would work out this way, but it did. And it's through the experience with Evelyn that we learned to fight these disentitlements, these positions where children have their Medicare cards taken away, and we're able to get the Medicare cards back and add more stability to these family situations. That's certain, very few, but certain living caregivers experience. So that's just an example, I guess, as a legal clinic supervision of looking at test cases that develop out of Evelyn and Pinai's experience. Now, putting aside the issue of criminal offenses under the criminal code, what we call the core criminal law in Canada, I would look at issues that arise in respect of living caregivers in Canada that would have aspects that apply to employment standards, human rights norms, notion of protection of victims of crimes, the notion of regulation, believe it or not, of lawyers, notaries, and immigration consultants who are the only authorized paid representatives to process applications for living caregivers, right? This last issue is something that's very, very, very current for Pinai and for myself. Dr. Smith referred to recruitment fees, right? So the notion of recruitment fees and the different forms that they can take for people coming to Canada. Living caregivers that come to the province of Quebec largely are paid at a minimum wage, and minimum wage is somewhere under $14 Canadian at this time. And if they're made to pay $5,500 to $7,000 worth of recruitment fees, that's pretty significant if you do the hourly calculation. Years ago, the notion of unreimbursed recruitment fees was supposed to have been addressed. On a federal level, a standard form contract was developed, which says very clearly that the employer must reimburse recruitment fees directly to a living caregiver upon presentation. It's in the contract. The contracts are submitted in the province of Quebec to the provincial immigration authorities, federally to the federal immigration authorities, and they're overseen, so to speak, by the immigration professional who is licensed to act. So in Quebec, we'd be talking about lawyers, members of the Bar of Quebec, or other lawyers licensed in Canada. We'd be talking about notaries, which is a special practice. They're able to process these types of things, and the federally regulated immigration consultants, right? So in one case, we have, unfortunately, come across a systemic practice by one of these professionals where they're not producing receipts. They're not doing an accounting for the monies received. So you can guess what the net result of that is, right? We're unfortunately caught in a position where they're not reimbursed these amounts, despite the fact that a private contract says they must be. What happens now is that we perhaps have to look at the federal or the provincial regulatory bodies and say, they have the power of discipline over these members. That's the way to force these people to give receipts and to prevent that further exploitation. So through these various mechanisms, non-criminal mechanisms, PNI and others are in a position to address labor, employment, other standards, and with the help of McGill law students, they can push these matters ahead, right? So that the cases don't fall by the wayside and women are not alone in their vulnerabilities to try and address these circumstances. I think Evelyn has a very interesting circumstance that she can tell us regarding the special circumstances of Quebec when women now come under these visas, a structural issue. So I look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton. Evelyn, you have the floor.
Okay. It's not a long statement that I have to do to let the public know that the people who recruits or facilitate the transport or recruitment of the live-in caregivers or caregiver to Quebec are not being told or being put in aware that Quebec, if they work in Quebec, their experience as a caregiver, Canadian experience as a caregiver in Quebec doesn't allow them or doesn't make them eligible to apply for permanent resident in Quebec because they are considered like a low-skilled worker, just like the farm workers. It's the two categories of the temporary workers that are not acceptable in Quebec to apply for permanent resident because they can get or qualify to apply for selection certificate of Quebec. So they have to leave the province and apply in another province, work there, apply, look for a job, and then settle, reside there, and then prove to the government, federal government, that they are already working and living in Ontario or somewhere else aside from Quebec. So I find that this is another fraudulent transaction between recruiters or something and to transport these women, because it's not fair that they settled here in Quebec, they worked for 2 years, and then they paid what they are supposed to pay, and then they end up, they have to resettle again somewhere else and adapt to the new environment and you know, face another challenges in another province. So that's all I wanted to say, to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I think this underlines quite neatly the complex of precarity that these women in the live-in caregiver programs, but also many migrants generally, many people who move or are moved around across borders, they find themselves at the mercy of others, and those others may be benevolent, it happens, but may also have profit as their first objective. So we're now moving to Samuel. Samuel, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to speak. I mean, I think Milton and Evelyn really summarized it very well. I don't have too much to add. One thing I'd say is I'd really emphasize the fact that the recourses for people who are experiencing some form of trafficking are not very evident to survivors of trafficking. and it really falls on the shoulders of organizations like PNAE, which are doing great work and have a form of relating to members of the community through some sort of common affinity. It really falls on their shoulders to show these survivors who are in the Filipino community what kind of recourses exist for them. Unfortunately, I think there's sort of there's two things that are rather unfortunate about that reality. The first thing is that organizations like PNAE don't have the infrastructure to be able to meet all of the needs for the really widespread problem of trafficking that exists in the living caregiver program. So that's the first issue. And then the second issue is a lack of sort of capacity to do as much outreach as needs to be done to get everyone familiar with the existence of organizations like PNAE, and also to let people know that like we can receive their legal issues, that we can like help them out with their problems. For instance, last week we were at the Metro handing out flyers for a presentation that was given on Saturday on psychological and sexual harassment in the workplace for PNAE. And we were at Palermo Metro, and leafleting to everyone who was coming out. It seemed like they were getting back from work. And there were a lot of Filipino women who hadn't heard of PNAE before. And it seemed to me like this kind of work was really valuable in terms of like just getting in touch with people in the community who don't know how to deal with their legal problems if they are being trafficked. So it's definitely those two issues that are being faced: the lack of infrastructure to support people with legal issues when they're being trafficked, and the lack of infrastructure for actually doing outreach so people know that those support systems exist. And then secondly, I'd say a big issue you see is like a really rotten kind of legal pluralism in which there seems to be all kinds of different there's sort of like a bad form of forum shopping, where there's like, you make a CNESST report, you make a report to the Commission de droit de personne et de la jeunesse, and there's all kinds of forms you have to fill out, and you have to apply for an open work permit, etc. And it can be very taxing, I think, on survivors. So clarifying exactly a very specific procedure for people who are being human trafficked to take, one procedure that really doesn't throw the labor on them to be able to actually get recourses, I think would go a long way for people.
Yeah, thank you very much. Taryn.
Yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of what Samuel just said in terms of how difficult it is to navigate these processes. Like one of the first things that we did for PNAE starting last semester was applying for this open work permit for vulnerable workers. And like Sam said, it was a bunch of different steps that we ended up needing to take, and even just gathering like all the evidence we needed for the CNESST complaint, the Human Rights Commission complaint, the work permit. It was like pictures of things, screenshots, an affidavit, and all these different complaints. And even like originally what seemed like maybe a very simple sort of story ended up being very complicated. Like we were going through the work contract, and I just remember Samuel going, I think everything in here was violated at one point, and I don't think he was wrong. It was like from pay deductions, not having your own space, doing work that wasn't actually in the work permit. And I think like these legal remedies end up not being necessarily very successful. People don't know their rights necessarily. They're relying on services like PNAE and law students, but obviously we don't have the resources to help everyone that really needs it. And I thought one of the things that was really interesting was when I was trying to figure out what this open work permit for vulnerable workers was and how you go about applying for it. One of the pages on the federal government's website has this like quick link to take you to Google, which presumably is for if you're in a situation, or the living caregiver person is in a situation where they have to be able to leave the website quickly because they're being monitored. But then if they're being monitored, I don't see how it's really possible for them to complete this process to file for an open work permit, because it took so much time and effort, and the form to do it is online. It's an online PDF that you fill in. And I think it took us like an hour of going around the federal government website to like create an account, to get to the form, to figure out how to do it. And it was not intuitive at all. And so it's just the fact that these workers are really tied to the one employer because their work permit is only for that specific employer, and they can't leave and change jobs easily if they're in a terrible situation without applying for this open work permit is really, really difficult for them. And similarly with the aspects of harassment in the workplace, again, like when I was looking at the CNESST website for this, it made a lot of sense, but it made a lot of sense for workers that aren't live-in caregivers, for people that work in offices or retail environments, because just the evidence that you would need to gather, you're not going to have witnesses if you're a live-in caregiver of harassment in the workplace. And it really depends on them being able to be out of the situation, because otherwise, if they make these complaints, then they're opening themselves up to retaliation and really ending that work relationship. And then they won't be able to stay in Canada because their immigration status is tied to this employer. So I think really it's just these people are placed in situations, unfortunately, where the opportunities for abuse are really rampant. And they're very dependent on their employers. And if their employers don't treat them well, then the ability for them to access any sort of legal remedies is unfortunately really, really difficult. And it's possible that employers don't actually face the consequences that they should, or others involved don't face the consequences that they should. That's what I have to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a compelling series of presentations and testimonies. One of the issue that in my work I have seen is again the notion of precarity. Many of these people are in a situation where access to people in the know, access to authorities, access to knowledge, simple linguistic ability to read a form, you were mentioning the form, are difficult, are extremely difficult. And we have a situation in most countries where migrants don't see labor law being applied. Migrants don't have the support of a union, which has been over the past century the best way to protect workers, to make sure that they can organize and collectively balance the power of the employers. This is not accessible for most migrants. They find themselves often alone, especially in the case of live-in caregivers, with one employer, and that employer has a hold on their whole life. If they're fired and lose their work permit and residence permit, they're sent back home packing with nothing in their hands. And often they have contracted debts to pay for the recruitment fees in particular, but not only. They have contracted debts that they have to reimburse, and they can't. And loan sharks out there can be violent. So it's a situation it's a situation of extreme precarity, and collectively in countries of immigration, North and South, because it's true in Malaysia and South Africa as much as it is true in Canada and Germany and other countries, we citizens don't care.